Calliope's Tale by FalcomReynolds. Chapter 15. Calliope Sees Vengeance. The captain forbade her from going, all of them in Dianthe. 5 different people told her she was not allowed to try and take on alizarin on her own. She didn't care. He had hurt Dianthe before, and he had almost made her kill herself to save everyone else. And he'd destroyed hundreds of lives in his fight from Baruni Hakur and in the battle earlier. She wouldn't put up with his existence any longer. As the moon, a thick gibbous, nearly full, rose over the sea, Calliope slipped back into the waters and slowed her heartbeat and breath. She did not want to be seen or noticed until she absolutely had to be. Denzel and Kiara had been right. Eliminate alizarin and his fleet would fall apart. They were smart to go right for him. They had done it too, obviously, and been unaware of his ambush. They had not had the upper hand like they'd thought. Alone, she could see everything. Alone, no one expected her. Alone, she didn't have to hold back. She dove. She knew where alizarin's fleet was. They didn't see her, deep as she was, and she bypassed every other ship in the fleet and came at the heretic directly from below, slow and steady. The spirits swarming around it didn't notice her. Not when she carefully hummed a shimmer into the water to keep her presence a secret. And, ever so carefully, she drifted up to the ship and placed her hand on the keel. She felt the ship breathing, and she felt the spirits trapped in the wood, in the masts and rope, in the sails. She could feel it all. Time to destroy it. She had air. She opened her mouth and sang the same note as before, but this time she sang it with all the force she could muster, as loud as she possibly could, and the water around her heated up. She could feel the echoes of her own note reverberating back to her, and she flinched to hear them, but she kept going. The iron and steel in the heretic's hull, though protected by spirits, was not prepared for her. Just like before, she watched it flash heat to brilliant glowing white and send out a burst of steam, and stretch and lose shape, allowing the planks to move. Not the entire ship, certainly not. She couldn't manage that while in the water like this. But while she was, but where she was, and that was enough. And perhaps her voice would reach further than she hoped. Some of the planks began to drift away, but she felt movement on the ship now. Panicked feet and running. They knew something was happening. Likely they knew she was here. She ripped at the ship and was rewarded as she felt the planks come away under her hand, watched water swirl into the hold and precious air bubble out. She laughed. Perhaps it would be this easy after all. She opened her mouth again and sang a more complex sequence of notes, and this time she felt the heat above the surface break out as fire sprang up on the hull and began to race across the wood, clinging to the wood. The shouting grew louder, and she heard several splashes as a few pirates abandoned the ship. So quick to flee, she mused, still grinning. How hilarious! How strong they were earlier, and how weak they were now. Turning, she rolled in place and slammed her tail into the ship. Once, twice, 3 times, and she felt the ribs of the ship crack under the impact. Even with her size and the water's resistance, she still had enough force to do that. She reached into the hold and ripped one of the ribs out, tossing it into the water. The ship began to pitch and take on water, and Calliope laughed again, tearing at another board. There was a bang from above, and she watched dispassionately as someone fired a gun into the water. What were they thinking? Bullets didn't penetrate the sea very well. She watched a metal sphere go drifting past her and reached up and into the ship, pulling at the hold ceiling, forcing water onto the next deck. The heretic pitched more violently and screamed as she began to slip under the surface. The other ships were closing in, but she didn't care. The heretic was sinking. Now, where was alizarin? Trapped in his own ship, unable to escape, already in the water. She looked around for him, searching for that red coat, for that figure, for that disgusting sense, for whoever was controlling the dead ships. The heretic was going down. She watched the deck submerge and the sail become drenched. There There he was, still in that stupid red coat, holding desperately on to the wooden rail. He looked up, saw her, and narrowed his eyes. And the heretic stopped sinking. Slowly, she halted, then began to rise upwards. Calliope stared first in confusion, then in horror as she realized if she killed the ship, it fell under Alizarin's jurisdiction. He could bring it back. Alizarin's triumphant grin spurred her into action. She hated him, hated his horrible smile, hated his gloating words. With a flick of her tail, Calliope darted forward onto the deck and planted herself on it. And as the heretic rose above the surface again, water streaming from the decks and portholes and the holes Calliope had knocked in the hull. And even now she could see anything attached by metal was only partially held together. But somehow, just like the dead ships, it was still alive, and she finally found herself face to face with Alizarin. "So," he said, and when he spoke, she could see the interior of his mouth filled with writhing tendrils of greenish-black flesh. They writhed and pressed against the insides of his cheeks, making them bulge outward. He didn't seem to notice. "You're Iante's little secret, are you?" "I'm not a secret anymore," Calliope said triumphantly. "I am—" She stopped. No. There was probably no point in giving Alizarin her name, and it had caused more trouble than she cared to collect. "I am here to kill you," she said instead. "Good luck with that," Alizarin laughed. One tendril slipped out in front of his teeth and curled over his lip. He tossed his head back and swallowed to pull it back into his mouth. "You can kill my ship, but I'll bring her back." "No, I'm here to kill you, not your ship." Calliope smiled, holding herself upright by sheer strength and force of will. There's a difference." "Again, I wish you the best of luck." "I won't need it." Calliope reached behind her and pulled out the harpoon gun. She aimed and fired. The shot went wide. She frowned, retracting the harpoon with a switch and a whirring sound, and tried again. As she fired, her hand jerked to the side, and the bolt whipped away and thunked into the wood of the now tilted ship's deck. "What?" "You can't hurt me," Alizarin taunted. Hissing, Calliope retracted the bolt, pulling herself towards it and towards Alizarin. He sidestepped, and she smacked into the side of the ship, sending it reeling so far over to the side she thought it would capsize again. Alizarin had to leap for the mast and hold on to avoid falling in the water. "That's right," Calliope called to him, grinning. "Come into my territory and let's see how well you do." "You're a real treasure," Alizarin sneered back. "Where did they find you?" "In the ocean. Are you an idiot?" The ship wrenched itself back upright with a scream of breaking wood, and Calliope found herself flung back across the deck. She skidded to a halt and caught herself against the stairs as Alizarin balanced himself carefully on the mast. The heretic began to pitch back to the other side, and she found herself nearly thrown off again. She searched for something to cling to and dug her claws into the stairs, snapping the boards entirely. "Iante really should have given herself up," Alizarin sighed, shaking his head. "It would have made killing the rest of you very, very easy. But you know what? Your soul will do just fine." "Too bad you won't get it." If she couldn't attack him, what could she do? The heretic began to stabilize again, and she dragged herself further onto the deck. "Not unless you can kill me." "I don't think that's going to be an issue." Calliope gritted her teeth. "I do," she panted, and hurled herself forward, shooting the harpoon gun again. It got closer to Alizarin, but still missed him. He laughed again. She couldn't attack him. She probably couldn't rip him apart with her hands, but could she just hold on to him? "What's so funny?" she asked, retracting the gun and getting closer. He stepped back, so small and quick and agile around her massive form. "It's just amusing, all this," he said. "You really think one single person is going to be able to stop me?
What could possibly give you that impression?
Overconfidence, Calliope replied, and leapt for him. He darted out of the way, and she hissed again and sheathed the harpoon gun.
That's also not going to work, Alizarin said. You can't attack me. You can't harm me. You physically cannot do it. I have ensured it.
Loopholes. Where was the loophole? There was always a loophole. Every agreement had its flaws. Every order had its blind spots. The more generic a command, the easier it was to subvert it. That's too bad.
Violence isn't the answer this time. Well, it isn't for you, anyway. It definitely is for me.
Alizarin went for a gun at his side, but when he tried to pull it out, it stuck. It had melted into a chunk of silvery slag and become glued to his clothing, and he glanced down at it and growled in frustration. Calliope grinned. Loopholes. There had to be something. If she couldn't act violently, maybe she could act non-violently, but in a manner that would still kill him. No, you're right. Violence sure isn't the way, she said. What if... This was ridiculous, but so was her entire attempt at taking down Alizarin's fleet with nothing but her claws and a harpoon gun. It sure is dangerous to be on board a sinking ship, isn't it? I think I'm going to save your life.
Excuse me?
Calliope lunged at him again, and this time he didn't dodge fast enough, and she grabbed him in what was essentially a double-armed hug, crushing him close to her chest. He yelped as she did so, and she tumbled forwards and off the ship into the water.
You... what?
Alizarin managed, and then Calliope took a deep breath, filling her lungs with smoke-tinged air, and dove. Holding on to Alizarin was hard. He was wriggly and slippery, and she kept feeling her arms involuntarily start to lose him. But she made sure to be careful and to not hurt him. She didn't want to hurt him. She wasn't going to hurt him. She was just taking him away from the very dangerous on-fire sinking ship. To save his life, of course. To keep him safe from the ship that could explode or burn or break. He could get a splinter. How kind and thoughtful of her. Now, if in the process of saving him, she accidentally took him somewhere and he became fatally injured, well, that wasn't her fault now, was it? No, of course not. That heavily flawed reasoning was, apparently, enough to convince the spirits that Alizarin had bound. Perhaps they were only governed by the exact words he'd used to work his magic. Perhaps, even dead, they still hated him and wanted him to suffer for what he'd done to them. Whatever the truth, it was enough. Calliope dove straight down. The flaming wreckage of the heretic began to sink above, and Alizarin was trying to hold his breath, but growing more and more panicked as Calliope powered downwards, away from the moon and the stars and into the depths. If anything, the goddesses of the ocean would be pleased to have Alizarin delivered directly to Athu's grasp. Calliope kept her arms locked around Alizarin's form. Around her, she felt spirits swarm over her skin. They knew what she was now, and she felt as they took the form of sharp little claws and tore into her skin, ripped at her hair, sliced through her fins. She rolled to try and shake them off, but they kept going. She tried to swat them away, and to her surprise she almost could. To hurt her, they had to take a physical form. She saw Alizarin squeezing his eyes shut, but watched him twitch his fingers and felt the spirits tear deeper. They're going to ruin my tattoos, she thought, infuriated, and powered downwards harder. She couldn't hurt Alizarin, couldn't rip his hands away to prevent him from controlling his stolen spirits. She just had to keep going. Around her, shapes flitted through the water. She couldn't catch them in her sight, only out of the corner of her eyes. More spirits? More tricks? She faltered and felt Alizarin struggle, trying to get free. At the same time, she felt her limbs lock up, her tail freezing in place, keeping her from tightening her grasp on Alizarin. She felt him wriggle again and start to free himself. No! She hissed out a barely audible note and felt the spirits recoil from her for a second, and in that second she renewed her dive, surging into the black. The pressure increased. She saw Alizarin frantically flailing, trying to pull himself out of her arms, and held on just as carefully as before, taking the utmost caution not to hurt him. She cupped one hand around his head and held him close, as if she were protecting him. Alizarin's mouth was shut, but he was covering his ears and eyes now. She could feel his body shaking. He was a scrawny little thing, really. No strength in him at all. Not here. And his hands were occupied. The flickering images in her vision were gone, and the spirits that had been nipping at her body had vanished. Without his hands, he couldn't do anything to hurt her. She grinned fiercely as she felt her body adjusting to the weight of the water over her. Alizarin was out of his depth and into hers. She kept going. All light was gone. She could see, but only barely, and Alizarin certainly couldn't. He was struggling still, but as she watched, the air in his lungs burst out from his mouth and spiraled upwards in a trail of bubbles. He reached out towards them, opening his eyes, unable to see but knowing where his air went, and the tendrils in his mouth spread outward and flailed, searching for air, anything at all. They unraveled into thin, slick lines that grasped at the water, stretching down to search past his neck to his torso, touching Calliope's skin once or twice. The feel of them was repulsive, like the faintest brush of a finger or fin, gentle, yet horrific. The temperature was dropping. She'd thought Denzel's magic was cold, but the deeper ocean here had her shaking, even through the layers of fat she'd grown from her steady diet of fish and whatever sea life she could get her hands on. The chill was seeping into her lungs, and she wondered how long she would be able to hold her breath. Even now, she felt the pressure pressing on her skull and ears, though her ears were protected by several layers of webbing when she went this deep. Alizarin finally went limp in her hands. She saw, more felt, really felt. His body convulsed once, felt him break, watched blood drift out of his mouth and nose in faint crimson clouds. She couldn't hear his frantic heartbeat anymore. Good enough. She let go, dropping him into the blackness. It disappeared instantaneously. And then she began to panic. Which way was up? She was completely disoriented. She tried to catch sight of Alizarin's body drifting, but it was gone, and even if she spotted it, could be going in any direction. Were there currents to catch it down here? She didn't know. She swam forward, then turned, then regretted turning. It didn't feel right. None of it felt right. She couldn't figure out what was the pull of the ocean floor and what was the pressure of the water and what might have been the push of a deep-sea current on her body. There was no direction here. She was suspended eternally in an endless void. She didn't want to die. She didn't want to die. She thought of Ianthe, of her pirate family, of the goddesses. Their faces ran through her mind. Mikulo singing, Ianthe with her arms spread and the goddesses burning in her blood. The goddesses! Maybe if she prayed to one, she'd be saved. Kalari. Storms. Nope. Zikal. Life? Maybe. Zoriel. Stone? Perhaps. Athu. Athu! She closed her eyes for a moment. Athu, show me the way to the surface. The ocean was merciless. Alizarin's body drifted further, vanishing into the black. Calliope shivered and tried to keep her heartbeat down. It pounded in her ears. The darkness was all-consuming. She closed her eyes for a moment. Athu, guide me out from your everlasting depths. Vast distant noises echoed from the far trenches, and the creatures that were miles away from her, low notes and distant scraping sounds, and the faintest echo of the underwater volcanoes rumbling. Calliope wrapped her arms around herself. Athu, please, I want to go home. And in the pitch darkness of the deep ocean, miles of emptiness surrounding Calliope in every direction, in a world where the moon and stars could never reach and even the sun did not exist, there was light. A faint yellow luminescence in the shadows before her, in a single oval patch. It brightened, dimmed, and brightened again. And then another lit up next to it, and another, and a whole row of ovals of neon yellow color, growing brighter as she watched, and then smaller lines of circular dots running along the ridge of something. Was that up? Was that down? What was Athu trying to tell her? She stared at it, baffled. Another line of yellow lights began to run through the darkness, and a few long, thin lines of light, and slowly Calliope realized what she was looking at. Above the seafloor, which lay not far below her, was a creature. She was larger than any undersea mountain Calliope had seen. Her black skin was craggy and ridged, sharp-edged plates of skin like scales mimicking rocks. Her tail lay on the seabed, half buried in the silt, and the luminescence she was giving off was glowing brighter and brighter as she woke up. She'd been asleep. The patches ran up her body to long, slice-like slits on her sides that puffed out water that glowed after it left her body. Gills, of a sort, and ahead of them 2 long, dark arms with strangely lengthened webbed hands. And above that, there was a thick, spiny neck and a smooth, hairless head with long stalks that felt for disturbances in the water and were tipped with glowing baubles. And then the eyes. She opened her eyes, and they were brilliant yellow, glowing enough to shine light on the seabed. Calliope saw small creatures scuttle out of the way of the light, hiding from the creature. After a moment, she opened her mouth just a sliver and sucked in water, and Calliope saw that the mouth stretched around most of her face and revealed rows of needle-like teeth in the light that glowed just inside. Calliope knew what this was, and she, was far more beautiful and far more terrifying than Calliope had ever thought she could be. This was a mer-matriarch, one of the eldest and strongest creatures that could ever exist, and she was staring at Calliope now. She wanted to speak to the creature, but she breathed air and couldn't risk losing it. And anyways, what would she say? Alizarin's corpse drifted downwards, a tiny dark splotch against the light. His coat floated in the water near Calliope while his body fell. She snatched the coat in one hand and watched the matriarch as she shifted her monochrome eyes from Calliope to Alizarin. She cocked her head to the side in interest, then reached out with one massive hand and carefully held him between 2 fingers. The wave her hand sent out nearly bowled Calliope over. He was dead, but the tendrils of his mouth still writhed around, grasping for air or something to hold on to. The light of the matriarch's eyes illuminated him enough to see the damage that had been done to his fragile human form. It wasn't pretty. The matriarch blinked, opened her mouth, and swallowed Alizarin's corpse whole. It vanished between her massive teeth. Calliope shuddered nervously, still holding the coat, as the matriarch looked up. She had no doubt that the matriarch would eat her given the chance, and that her gigantic body only looked slow and lethargic. The creature was probably swifter than a swordfish. But instead, the matriarch closed her eyes, and then breathed out through the gills at her sides. Puffs of neon light spread over the ocean floor, curling luminescence produced by the matriarch that shone across more and more of the soft seabed, billowing clouds like smoke that glimmered against the mud. It took a few seconds for Calliope to understand. "Athu, thank you," she thought. She put her tail to the light and swam up. The matriarch's glow was powerful enough, and it was growing as she left, that she could see it for most of her swim up. It was so strong it only faded when she had left the midnight zone and could see a hint of the moon above her. And she slowed and stopped, astonished, because as she swam up, she passed the slowly sinking wrecks of Alizarin's stolen ships. They were returning to the seabed. She hoped the matriarch wouldn't mind too much. Athu was reclaiming what was hers. She kept going, but did not surface above the matriarch. Instead, she oriented herself by the stars and swam back towards the midnight sun and the collective fleet. When she finally broke the surface, she found herself crying massive, salty tears, shaking as she did so. Her lungs and torso ached from the strain of the changing pressure and the air that had been trapped inside them. She left herself floating in the water for a bit in the moonlight until she had control of herself once again. Then she wearily knocked on the sun's hull until someone woke up and came to see what was the issue. It was Sirio, rubbing at his eyes. "Let me up," Calliope said. "Calliope, it's the dead of night," said Sirio, sounding exhausted. "I killed Alizarin and fed him to a matriarch," Calliope told him. "I'll wake Ayesha," Sirio replied. It took a few moments for the ship to wake up, but once it did, Calliope was hauled out of the water and immediately swarmed. She flopped onto the deck, causing the ship to list to the side a bit, and threw Alizarin's sodden coat down onto the planks. "He's dead," she said, resting her elbows on the wood and folding her hands over one another. "He won't be a problem anymore." The crowds of crew members parted, revealing Ianthe, who was up and walking, though unsteadily, with Mikulo close by. She looked down at the coat and up again, then swiftly stepped forwards and put her arms around Calliope's neck, burying her face in her shoulder. Calliope went slightly tense, startled. "Ianthe?" she asked, as quietly as she could. "For 15 years, I have lived in fear of one day meeting Alizarin and dying to him. I know that even if I killed him, I would die in my attempt to do so. But you've saved me." "I mean, it's only fair," Calliope said with a shrug. "You all didn't leave me to die when I was little." "How did you do it?" She smiled, long and slow, sharp in the moonlight. "I took him somewhere he couldn't go." "I don't understand." "Humans," Calliope said carefully, still remembering the feeling of the water crushing her ribs, "can't go down very far. I can." Silence again, and this time Calliope could see the dawning horror and admiration on the faces of the crew around her. She let herself grin. Ianthe shook her head. "The ships he enslaved? Sank to the seabed? Oh, she really hoped the matriarch wouldn't be annoyed by that. Probably not. The souls? Free." Calliope upended the coat, and the fragments of glass fell sparkling to the planks. The remnants of the tiny bird cages Alizarin had kept with him. The souls within them were gone, their captor dead and their prisons shattered. "So these," Ianthe began, and then stopped, tilting her head to the side. Calliope could hear whispers in the breeze, but couldn't make out what they said. After a moment, Ianthe looked back to her. "I am told," Ianthe said slowly, "that you called upon Athu." No, I didn't channel her or anything, but I got lost. She woke up the matriarch. I was disoriented down in the deep, in the dark. The light showed me which direction to go. The matriarch, she breathed light." Calliope let out a breath, remembering the uncaring cold of the abyss, the deep squeezing of the pressure on her lungs, the weight of the ocean threatening to crush her head, her eyes, burst her ears. The matriarch had been one with the ocean, unbothered by the weight of the sea above her. Calliope shivered. Would she become that someday? Ianthe nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly, and Calliope could tell the statement wasn't directed towards her. Ianthe's eyes were unfocused, staring beyond Calliope, beyond the ship into the ocean. "Thank you for bringing her back to me, to us," she added, glancing back to Mikulo and the crew. For a second she hesitated, then said, "You saved my daughter, and for that I owe you my life." Another moment passed. Ianthe listened, and finally looked down to the planks, smile bright on her face. "She says that by killing Alizarin, you have already paid the debt for both of us." There was a moment of silence. Calliope pulled herself over and pressed herself against Ianthe. She felt the first mate laugh, breathless, and lean against her. After another moment, Mikulo chuckled as well. "What?" Ianthe asked, glaring at him. "Not you," Mikulo said, shaking his head. "The other captains. They're absolutely going to lose their minds